Hello friends, I am Ashley DeZonia and this is my presentation on marriage and family therapy. First off, let's start with what is marriage and family therapy? So the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, the AAMFT, describes marriage and family therapy as a brief, solution-focused, specific with attainable therapeutic goals, and designed with the end in mind. This means that marriage and family therapists don't go into sessions or don't go into seeing new clients without seeing the end and figuring out and setting goals to attain that. And so then we want to know, what is a marriage and family therapist? And so again, the American Association for Marriage and Family Therapy, the AAMFT, describes marriage and family therapists as mental health professionals trained in psychotherapy and family systems and licensed to diagnose and treat mental and emotional disorders within the context of marriage, couples, and family systems. This means that it's not just anyone on the street. There are specific guidelines, there are specific courses, there are specific things, licenses and stuff like that, that someone has to have to be a marriage and family therapist. So let's get a little bit of history on marriage and family therapy. So what I found was that marriage and family therapy started in the late 50s. My source, Karam et al., 2015, states that with a series of rebellious pioneers who rejected the dominant individual-based behavior and psychoanalytic models of the time in favor of something new, marriage and family therapy came about. And so these rebellious pioneers didn't like the fact that at the time therapy was very individual-based, it was very psychoanalytic, it wasn't based on people together. And so they wanted something different. They were willing to go and do things that others hadn't done. They were willing to take risks, and they were willing to do the research needed to really bring about the new change in the profession of marriage and family therapy. And so then, fast forward to the early 70s, and this was where the real change started to happen. And so during the early 70s was when these pioneers started to determine the difference between all the different models that there were out there that were available. And all of these different models were brought about because all of these different pioneers or researchers were trying to label each one as their own unique and pure form of family therapy, which means that they were all trying to create and label their own model, which meant that there was a lot of research done, and they really had to determine the difference between all of these models to know which one was going to be best to follow. And so then in the late 70s, programs were moved onto university campuses, which this means that prior to the late 70s, programs were initially held on private campuses, private institutions, in different little places like that. They were never in big universities, state universities and stuff like that. They were only in small programs. And so this meant that there was a lot of change. This meant that the U.S. Department of Education recognized the Commission on Accreditation for Marriage and Family Therapy as the national accrediting body for marriage and family therapists, which this meant that there was now a specific commission, a specific association that was in charge of not licensing but accrediting marriage and family therapists, which again means that even then it couldn't just be anybody on the street. There were specific routes you had to take. And so this was also the point where training started taking on multiple models, which meant that there were different models that you were studying, but it didn't mean that they interlocked any of these models. They were still very like specific. And so they still wanted you to learn about one model and then the next and then the next, and then they wanted you to pick your favorite and stick with it, which meant that they wanted you to pick one model that you really connected with and research that model and that model only. That way that they could funnel you into a specific program and you didn't have to keep going back and forth with classes, and they didn't have to integrate all of the models together. And so then let's go into talking about licensure. So as a marriage or family therapist, you had to have a license. That's what the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, that's why they recognized the COA MFTE was so that they could create a need for licensure. And so originally, with the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapy, it was a strictly voluntary basis. You only had to register if you wanted to be nationally accredited. It wasn't mandatory. And they determined that because of this and the program evolving, that they needed something different. And so something wasn't working. And so they created the licensure process in every state. And so they funded it and they backed it and they did the research and they really pushed and they really allowed for each of these states to have their own licensure program so that it was mandatory, that it can't just be somebody being one state accredited. It means that all 50 states have their own licensure process, including DC, which means that each state has specific things. They're all generally the same, but each state has little specific things, and the AAMFT helped each state determine these processes. And so I've included the Arkansas Board of Examiners in Counseling and Marriage and Family Therapy logo, simply to show you that that's where I am from and that that's where I will be practicing. And so then we go into methods. And so the methods are fairly simple. There's either a single method process, which means you use one method. There's a multi-method process, which means you use more than one method, but you don't combine the results. Or there's a mixed method process, which that means that you use more than one method, but you combine the results. You use all of the different methods to figure out your results instead of using each one to have specific or separate results. And so one of the great things that I found when doing my research was that spirituality is very important in marriage and family therapy, but it's not something that we have a ton of training on. And so there was a ton of need. Research found that there was a ton of need. I think it was 72% of 72.6% of students indicated that it was desirable to receive supervision and training around spiritual issues, but 92.2% of students said they had not received this kind of training, which means that there's a huge need for it out there. One of the things about involving spirituality with our therapy is that we have to know our own standing and respect the differences of each other. And so God views marriage very sacredly. He thinks that marriage is very important. He thinks that in Hebrews 13:4, he states that marriage should be honored by all and the marriage bed kept pure, for God will judge the adulterer and all the sexually immoral. And then also in Proverbs 15:22, God says, plans fail for lack of counsel, but with many advisors they succeed. Pretty much calling himself, or not calling himself, but relating to counselors and saying that, hey, we need them.